Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast. We cover everything Major League, from spring training to the World Series. We've got your favorite club covered, from New York to Boston to LA. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Ridenour, and I've got a really good show in store for us today. We are inching closer and closer to the baseball season. Teams have actually already made their way slowly down to Florida for spring training, so a very good sign. Pitchers and catchers have already reported. Position players are going to be reporting this week, so that is a very exciting sign, and that means that we're getting back into baseball. It means warmer weather, and I won't have to come on here and complain about how cold it's been in Pittsburgh, which, again, now that I'm looking outside, I continue to see snow, and I can't wait until I can see the grass on the ground behind my apartment instead of just straight snow. But anyways, I hope everyone is still doing well and hanging in there. I know that we're slowly getting out of this cold, kind of season and whatnot. But I want to get into some baseball. I want to get into kind of the news, the typical news segment. I'll have some fun and exciting news segments to share with you all. So I'm going to dive right into it. And I'll first kick things off with a general run-through of any and all of the latest news going around the MLB and the league and so on and so forth. I'll also touch on some recent free agency moves since we are winding down a little bit with that. I'll then get into an interesting second segment, sharing some of the most iconic broadcasters/journalists to ever cover the sport of baseball and what their stories were as to how they got to where they are today covering baseball, and really what their legacy is like that they've left and continue to leave on the sport of baseball. Later, I'll get into a free agency grading of a division, as I'll start off with the NL East and share some of the biggest moves made by teams in that division and give a grade for the teams, but then also the division as a whole to kind of really gauge how things were kind of executed during this offseason for those teams. And make sure you stick around for the last few minutes of the show today, as I'll get into a buy it or deny it segment, highlighting whether I buy or deny the idea that the NL will have more 95-plus win teams than the AL will this season. So don't go anywhere, because you don't want to miss that conversation. A lot of really good stuff on the horizon. But I think I'm going to start with some of the more recent news. Well, one of the more recent headlines, I guess, if you will, as Ian Desmond, the Colorado Rockies outfielder, has decided to not play in 2021 as of now. So again, Ian Desmond has had a very good career. I mean, he was very good when he was in Washington. And I've gone on this show and I've said this before. He was kind of one of those predecessors to the power hitting, real heavy hitting, home run hitting kind of shortstops that are kind of a more popular thing, if you will, nowadays. I mean, he's always been a big home run guy. Not to mention, I mean, when he was with the Nationals, he put up some really good numbers, and he was an all-star a couple times. If I'm not mistaken, I believe he was a Silver Slugger a few times. He was a two-time all-star, a three-time Silver Slugger. I mean, there were seasons where he was putting up 20-plus homers and 80-plus RBIs year after year. So he had a lot of really good success in his career so far, and he still wants to play. That's the thing, is right now, he has said that his desire to be with his family is more than with being with baseball and with his team and so on and so forth. He will continue to work out, and he will continue to kind of monitor the situation regarding the pandemic. That's the real reason why he's kind of opting out as of right now of the season. He doesn't want to go and risk getting hit sick. He doesn't want to risk anybody else around him getting sick, so he's opting out as of right now. He's already forfeited his salary from last year, which was about $5.5 million. And as of now, if not playing in 2021, he will again forfeit another season of salary, which he'll be making around $8 million. He signed a pretty solid extension, I would say, back in 2017, 2018 with the Colorado Rockies. He's been solid for the Rockies in those few seasons. I mean, he's belted 49 homers, knocked in 193 RBIs, batted .252 while he's been with the team. So not staggering numbers, but still pretty solid numbers, especially for a veteran shortstop when you've got guys on that team like Trevor Story, right? And you've got guys that, are going to be coming up through the ranks eventually. They're looking for that veteran leadership. And Desmond can kind of be that bridge between the new guys coming up and really being those franchise players for the Rockies. I know that they've moved him to the outfield. He was at times a shortstop, but that's the beauty of Ian Desmond. You can move him around the field wherever you want to put him. Desmond has been, again, active in the meantime. He hasn't really been just hanging out, not doing much. I mean, he's gone out and he's helped with foundations. He's trying to revive the youth baseball scene in Sarasota. So this past year, when he wasn't playing, he was very active in his local community. And his teammates and the Rockies' own manager, Bud Black, they were all very supportive of him. They were very supportive of his decision. Bud Black had nothing but nice things to say about Ian Desmond. So that is, again, another really good sign that although that these guys are having to make these really tough decisions, and I'm sure Ian Desmond really had to think about this one because, let's face it, last year can totally see how guys wanted to opt out, right? I mean, there was not a whole lot of information about the pandemic or COVID. Guys were not as, I would say, educated on it. Just people in general weren't as educated on it as we are now because we've been going through this for a year. So I'm sure that coming into this season, Desmond did have a little bit of thinking to do to kind of sit down and say, okay, what do I want to do, right? I mean, we know that the vaccine's rolling out. There is hope that it will be out in the summertime. So at this point this year, it's a lot better than it was probably a year ago. So he probably had to really mull over this decision, and ultimately I think he made a good choice. You know, obviously you love to see guys out on the field, but health and safety comes first and foremost, no matter what. And so I think Desmond, his priorities were in the right direction without question. And now getting into the Rockies and kind of what they're going to do to try and replace Desmond, because he will be missed in that lineup, there are a lot of different possibilities. I mean, there are some minor league players like Jonathan Daza who could make a big case for starting in the lineup. I mean, he's their number 12 prospect in the MLB pipeline. So somebody that is probably going to have a very good career eventually. Brett Boswell is another possibility. I mean, he's been very good in the Rockies farm league system. He batted .296 in single A in 2018. So there's a lot of different possibilities. And this is also a situation that could change, right? Desmond could, without question, change his mind and say, hey, actually, I want to play. I want to go back out there. I want to get back with the guys. And I saw a lot of different things where teammates of his on the Rockies, they were saying that he was texting them throughout this entire thing. He was texting them throughout all of last year, encouraging them. He was still very active with the team. He just was not there physically. So that's, I think, again, shows you who Ian Desmond is. He is such a team guy, and that he's willing to, even though he's not there, he's willing to still share his knowledge with everybody on the team and also be that kind of somebody that can hype his team up, somebody that can be a support system and kind of somebody in the background right now to keep these guys, you know, spirits up, especially with kind of this weird season we're going to be going through with the pandemic. And not to mention the Rockies, they really struggled last year, especially after a really strong start, and they kind of came tumbling down. So having a guy like that right there and always supporting the team, I think that, again, speaks volume to who Ian Desmond is. But as of right now, Ian Desmond is not going to be playing in 2021. But there's some other very controversial news, and probably, in my opinion, the worst time to have this circling around your ball club with the season starting very, very soon. As the Seattle Mariners president and CEO, Kevin Mather, has now stepped down and resigned from his duties for some of the comments he made during an online event that has since, again, been taken down off of YouTube. And first and foremost, in this day and age, with technology, with everything being recorded, everything can be posted, everybody can have a ton of access to the most amount of information at the click of a button, right? Why in the world, for somebody that is, again, in a very high-profile business in sports, a high media volumes, again, field, if you will, a lot of media, there's a lot of, online traffic, if you will, so on and so forth, you're going to be subject to interviews, you're going to be subject to being recorded. So as a result, whatever you say is going to be projected and put out there in the public. You've got to be really mindful with what you're saying. You've got to be really, really careful, especially if you're in front office management and you're representing your team from the MLB. That just should not happen. But I'm going to get into what exactly happened and kind of unpack this whole situation. So Mather basically discussed numerous things that he probably should not have. And he was on the Bellevue Breakfast Rotary Club. It was on their YouTube page. It has now since been taken down. It was, I believe, an interview or I guess a guest appearance by Mather, whatever it might have been. But he issued an apology on Monday. because of, again, he said majority of Sunday he was calling people and apologizing for what he said, and I believe it was over the weekend or maybe it was late last week. But some of the things he discussed were just not okay. I mean, he was critical of the Mariners' number one prospect, Jared Klenick, declining a 6-year deal to instead pursue making a big league roster and making more money in free agency, as opposed to signing a deal that puts him in the minors for a certain number of seasons. So the whole deal was Klenick felt that he's got the ability and the talent to play at the major league level. Mather did not think so and thought it would be better for him to sign this contract. And so he was very critical of Klenick and basically saying, why in the world would you do that? And he was quoted by saying he thinks after 6 years, and again, this is a quote from Mather, he thinks after 6 years he'll be such a star player that the 7th, 8th, 9th year options will be undervalued. He might be right. He might be right. We offered and he turned us down. So Mather was there talking about Klenick and obviously was not very happy, kind of beating around a bush, basically saying, you were a fool not to sign. I don't know why you didn't. But then it just kept getting worse from there. Mather also made comments about the team's number 2 prospect, Julio Rodriguez. Now, again, mind you, he is talking about 2 of the best players in the Mariners farm system. Why in the world would you be talking about them in that negative way when they are essentially going to potentially be the franchise players for your organization down the road? Your success might be based on how they perform. Why would you want to speak down on them? And he basically said that Julio Rodriguez's English was not very good, and Rodriguez actually responded on Twitter in frustration, saying that he took personal offense to that. And quite frankly, I would too, right? I mean, why in the world does your president CEO have to go on an interview and say, yeah, his English is not very good? Just leave it alone. Why not just talk about how he's doing as a player, who he is as an individual? What in the world does that have to do with anything? But then it just kept getting worse. Mather also made reference to Hisashi Iwakuma, who was an all-star pitcher with the Mariners that is now a special assignment coach for the Mariners, and he was making comments about his English when he played for the Mariners, saying that, and this was Mather. Mather was basically saying how he was annoyed and he was very frustrated that he had to pay a translator for Iwakuma for 6 years. So, again, why in the world are you complaining about having to help a guy out so it's easier for him to communicate with guys on the team that you are, again, essentially in charge of? Why in the world are you speaking on this? Like, I don't understand why there was a need to bring that up. And, I mean, I don't know what the questions were. Again, the interview has since been taken down, so nobody can really access it. So I have no idea what those questions were like and what the setup questions were. But nonetheless, it is very easy to, if it's, again, a very kind of subjective question and you're kind of really, hinting at something, there's no problem with just giving a very plain, bland answer and avoiding something, right, and not having to touch on it. Mather did not need to say anything about how he was annoyed he had to pay a translator. He didn't need to say anything about a guy's English not being good, and he didn't have to say anything about a guy not wanting to sign a contract. So a lot of really just ill-advised moves ultimately led to his resignation as the president of the Mariners, so he's no longer there. But Mather, in all honesty, he was also involved with a lot of other scandals. He was involved in a sexual harassment complaint in 2018 by a couple women in the Mariners organization. They are no longer with the organization, and I believe from what I heard the report was about that, was that the Mariners and I guess the women that were in that case and in that kind of complaint and whatnot, they'd made amends, so who knows what that means. But again, this is not what you want going into the season, right? You don't want this negative publicity. Now they're probably going to have to scramble around and figure out who their next president and CEO is and whatnot. But at the same time, this could be, oddly enough, a blessing in disguise, and here's why. Maybe his management, maybe how he was handling things, maybe how he was running the team and his decision-making, maybe that was a lot of the reasons why this team has not been that successful in quite some time. Maybe that's the reason why that they haven't been to the playoffs in over 10, 15 years. They've got one of the longest playoff droughts, if not the longest playoff drought in all of baseball. So this could be a total shift in kind of, again, approach to building the team, culture, everything, winning, the whole thing. So maybe this is what they needed. Maybe they needed kind of a fresh set of eyes, a fresh breath of air, and somebody new to come in, revitalize this organization, and really build it back up to where it can be. They've got talented guys. They've got a lot of guys that can be really, really good. And it's just, again, a matter of, I think, sometimes it comes down to personnel, and sometimes it's not the personnel necessarily on the team, but it's sometimes the personnel up in management. And again, right here is a perfect example. So we'll have to see how this plays out ultimately for the Mariners, who's going to be hired as their new president, but more importantly, how is their team going to continue on in the future, and how might that new president come in and help build this team up to a winning franchise? So again, some very interesting news, very kind of unsettling news, but I want to close out the intro segment with just a little bit of free agency news involving two teams, one of them being the Braves and the other one being, you can probably guess it, the New York Mets. The Braves went out and picked up Jake Lamb, and the Mets went out and signed Tawan Walker. I like both moves. I would probably say I like the Mets move more than I like the Braves move. Lamb, actually, he's got a lot of potential. He's got a lot of ability. He's got a good bat, and he's got the capability to put up big numbers. In 2017, he had 30 homers, 105 RBIs. He was an all-star, but he hasn't been the same since, and that's the problem. He suffered a rotator cuff injury the following season, and his numbers have really not been the same. I mean, he went from a 248 average in 2017, which is, again, not great, but you're hitting 30-plus homers, so you can't really complain about the average. But then in 2018, he went down to 222. And then ever since 2017, he has not batted above 10 home runs. He has not touched 10 home runs. He's touched 5, 6 home runs here, 6 home runs there. That's about it. He has not come close to that 30 home run mark that he was at in 2017. I think that he could be a reliable bat. If he's healthy and if he can stay healthy the whole year, I could definitely see him being that X factor in the lineup when you see, Freddie Freeman, Marcell Ozuna, and then all of a sudden you've got Dansby Swanson, and you've also got Ronald Acuna Jr. and Ozzie Albies, and the list goes on. Jake Lamb can be that guy that people might forget about, but and in that case, if you forget about him, he's going to still do a lot of damage. And so that, I think, is going to be kind of what Lamb uses in his advantages. Oh, I'm the last resort on this team, but I can still do a lot at the plate, and so guys are going to still have to respect me, but I probably won't get the respect that the other guys on the team do, and as a result, it might pay off for him. It really might. I think Lamb could have, probably a pretty good season, but again, he's got to stay healthy, and he's shown power potential. I mean, in 2017, he had a career-high 844 OPS. And then this past year, after hitting 116 and a 380 OPS when he was with Arizona, he got traded at the deadline to Oakland, and then that's where things started to turn around. And so I think that's why I'm a little bit hopeful for Lamb, is because he had a big flip in his season. He went from having a 116 average to a 267 average. He went to having a 380 OPS to an 882 OPS. So when he went from Arizona to Oakland, completely different story. And what is something else that's interesting about going from Arizona to Oakland? You're going from a non-contending team to a contending team. And now Lamb is with another contending team. So maybe they got him at the right time in his career. Maybe they got him on kind of an uptick that he's on right now. And hopefully if he can stay healthy and that rotator cuff can stay healthy, maybe he can be, again, that added extra oomph offensively in their lineup that they can allow to maybe even give them a bigger push into the playoffs. Now, getting into the Mets, getting Tawan Walker, I think that this just adds way more firepower. Again, this just continues to strengthen the pitching rotation that this Mets team have. Now you've got Jacob deGrom, you've got Noah Syndergaard, you've got Marcus Strowman, you've got Tawan Walker, and you've got Carlos Carrasco. That's a really good starting five if you ask me. I don't know if it's necessarily the starting five that the Padres have, but it's still a really, really dominating starting five. In 2017 and 2018, for Tawan Walker, they were back-to-back years for him pitching under a 3.5 ERA. So he's got the capability of being a low ERA guy. He's got a pretty good strikeout rate as well. And he can be a great back-end rotation starter. He'd be a perfect guy to have as the 4 or 5 starter because, again, on a lot of other teams, he'd probably be their top 3, but he's just going to be on a really heavy pitching team that features, one guy that has won 2 Cy Youngs, one guy that's been a finalist for a Cy Young, and Strowman and Syndergaard that are perennial all-stars pretty much as pitchers. So he's a really good piece. Again, he's very similar to Lamb in the fact that I think a lot of teams might not give him the respect that he deserves because of the other guys that are in front of him. And then as a result, guys might ease up that day that they're going up against Walker, and he just blows it right by them, and he pitches a shutout or whatever it might be. Now, in Seattle last year, his ERA did touch 4, but then he got traded again to Toronto, and it dropped to a 1.37, and he totaled 50 Ks between the two teams. So 25 Ks with the Mariners and 25 Ks with the Blue Jays. So again, very similar to Jake Lamb. You go from one team, you're not having a great season, you jump to the next one, and you're having a really good season. And what did Jake Lamb do? He went from a non-contending team to a contending team. What did Tawan Walker do? He went from a non-contending team in Seattle to a contending team in Toronto. Now they're both with different contending teams, so that I think might bring out the talent and the ability in them even more, because they're going to be exposed to, again, more media. They're going to have more eyes on them. So now we can really see them and how they perform at the biggest stage. But also, come playoff time, these are guys that might be those extra pieces that ultimately push their respective teams over kind of that hump or whatever it might be to get into the playoffs and go further into the playoffs. But I think both teams are very, very nice adds for their respective teams. Ultimately, I will have to say I do like the Mets getting Walker more than the Braves getting Lamb, but that's just me. But ultimately, we'll have to see how things play out in a couple weeks, really. So that'll do it for us in this first segment, but don't go anywhere, because when I get back from the commercial break, I'm going to highlight the most iconic baseball broadcasters and journalists to ever cover the sport of baseball in its lengthy history. Folks, stay right there. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA, to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
Welcome back to the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Jack Ridenour with you all, and in our first segment, I got right into some of the latest news in the MLB and also discussed some of the brief free agent moves that have happened recently as well. But be sure to stick around for the final few minutes of the show today, as I'll discuss another buy it or deny it segment, as I'll get into whether I buy or deny the idea that the NL will have more 95-win teams in the league as opposed to the AL. But I want to now get into some of the most iconic broadcasters and journalists, and really just sports media figures, to have ever covered the game, in my personal opinion at least. Some who are still covering the game to this day, and I'll mention their stories as well as to how they got to where they are today, and really just anybody's story as to how they got to where they were at that point in their career. So a lot of different guys that I kind of almost identify baseball covering, journalism, broadcasting with. There's always those figures throughout time that I feel, even in all sports, that you kind of associate with certain voices, certain writers, whatever it might be. You associate those sports with those voices, those writers, those journalists, those broadcasters, anchors, whatever. There's something about it. So I'm going to get through a couple of them, and I'm going to discuss kind of their stories and whatnot. Getting into number one, or not really number one, but the first one, Vin Scully. Vin Scully's got to be one of the most prominent voices in baseball history, in my opinion. I mean, he was the voice of the Dodgers for 67 seasons. He started with them when they were in Brooklyn in 1950, and then ended his tenure with them in 2016 when they were obviously in L.A. But 67 years. That's incredible. Think about all of the research he had to do. Think about all of the knowledge that he had, and just also all of the change that he probably witnessed in the game as well. When you think about it, baseball has come a long way in the last 67 years or so. So it's going to be it's got to be pretty incredible to be able to cover a sport that you absolutely love that much for that long. And, I mean, that's the dream. That's what I would love to do, right? I would love to be able to cover a sport that I love, like baseball or basketball or football or whatever, for 60-some-odd years. That's incredible. So back to Vin Scully, though. He's known for many famous calls, and really his introduction, where he'd kick off all broadcasts with, "It's time for Dodger baseball. Hi, everybody, and a very pleasant good afternoon or evening to wherever you may be." So, again, those iconic words, those iconic phrases, and he's got many of them. He started out being a Giants fan, living and growing up in New York, and he served in the Navy, and then he got into broadcast journalism at Fordham University in New York, and Fordham University is today still very well known for their broadcasting. And he actually, this is another fun fact, he founded their well-known student radio station, WFVU, which is still, again, running today, and it actually gives out a Vin Scully Lifetime Achievement Award every year. So, I mean, he really kind of set the groundwork for one of the top broadcasting schools in America today. And he wore a lot of different hats while he was there at Fordham. I mean, he was the assistant sports editor for the Fordham Ram. He sang in a barbershop quartet. He played center field for Fordham. He called baseball games, basketball games, football games for Fordham. So he did a lot of different stuff. And I was really kind of mesmerized by the idea of him being a barbershop quartet. That's kind of interesting. But it also speaks to how he was with his voice. Obviously, I mean, he probably had a lot of practice singing, so it probably was able to make his voice sound in a certain way that was very appealing to people. So when he graduated from Fordham, he wound up sending 150 letters to various stations around the Eastern Seaboard looking for a job, wanting to get on the mic, and he had one response. 1 out of 150, and it was in Washington, D.C., and it was a CBS affiliate radio station, and he was just a fill-in for them. He wasn't even the main guy. Now, as time went on, he eventually became the youngest person to ever call a World Series game at the age of 23. At the age of 23, he was calling a World Series game. And after that, he became the Dodgers' main announcer. Now, what had happened was the other announcer that the Dodgers had, I guess there was some disgruntlement with the front office management. They wound up just getting rid of him, and he actually went on and covered the Yankees for many, many years. And then Vince Scully took over as the Dodgers guy, and he, again, the rest is history, if you will. Now, this is a very interesting thing about how Vince Scully would conduct his broadcast, because it was not a traditional broadcast with his partners, because nowadays you've got play-by-play and color commentators, right? The play-by-play guy describes what's going on, and then the color commentator kind of fills in the blanks, kind of colors in the broadcast, if you will. So then Scully, though, on the other hand, he would just roll solo. He would just do the whole thing, and then his partners would come on solo in the third inning and the seventh innings. So Scully really just kind of took the bull by its horns, essentially, and just ran the whole show himself, while his partner usually would come on for a couple innings here and there. Scully wound up actually having one of the most successful careers on air. He was an icon that was loved by many, and he's somebody that's name is going to be etched in baseball lore forever. And I mean, there was actually kind of a big thing on there was a big thing when he was starting to retire. He was thinking about retiring, and I guess that he wanted to announce that he was going to do one more year on the mic. And I think he was on either Jimmy Kimmel or some late night show, and they basically had these kind of flip cards, or almost these, you know, flash cards or whatever, cue cards, and he was just kind of flipping through them, and eventually it said, "I'm going to be back for one more year." And you know, I'm sure a lot of people were very, very excited for that, but ultimately his, you know, time came to an end, and you know, he's still around today, and he's still actually on Twitter. He's very active. He's always in the Dodger community, staying up to date on stuff and whatnot. So it's really, really nice that I think that, you know, what you can do as a broadcaster and as a journalist to everybody else, that people want you to come back so much and tell them what's going on. That's something I think that is incredibly powerful. And Vince Scully, he did that for so many years, and I really aspire to be like somebody like Vince Scully. So now, getting into the next one, Jack Buck. I think this is another guy that I think that really, really, really resonates throughout all of baseball, especially in Cardinal community, especially in Cardinal country, whatever you want to call it. But he also had a very interesting story as well. And he had a very different way to start him. I mean, he was born around the Great Depression time. He almost actually dropped out of high school. And because of the encouragement of a teacher, he wound up finishing and started working on an iron ore freight. So he was doing that for a little while, and then they did a test, actually, on the workers, and they found out that Buck was actually colorblind. He couldn't differentiate between the green and brown colors, and as a result, he couldn't continue his job. So then he just went into the Army. He didn't really know what else to do. He got drafted in the U.S. Army. He served from 1943 to 1946. He was actually injured in combat, and he wound up winning a Purple Heart, so somebody that was very decorated in the war. And then after that, he enrolled at OSU, at Ohio State. How he got into Ohio State was a friend of his needed a roommate to take classes at Ohio State. So he asked Jack Buck and said, "Hey, why don't you come take classes? You can be a student as well." So he wound up getting a spot at the school. He was this guy's roommate and whatnot. He held a lot of different odd jobs when he was at Ohio State. He was working at a gas station. He then wound up calling Columbus Redbirds games, which at that time they were a AAA affiliate, and then they also called Rochester Red Wings games. So then he eventually, after doing all these kind of odd-end jobs and doing these different broadcasting gigs, he got invited to broadcast Cardinals games. So after a couple games and after, you know, a season or two, he was eventually hired by the Cardinals. They liked him that much. But here's the interesting thing. He then was fired for somebody else after a year or two, and then he was rehired again by the Cardinals in 1961. So he went from being hired to fired to rehired in about a 10-year span. Pretty impressive, if you ask me. He's got a lot of famous calls, but one of them is "That's a Winner," and that's something that has, again, really rung through the entire airwaves of all of baseball. And his son, Joe Buck, as we all probably know who he is, he's, again, now taken that kind of reign of, and said, and sometimes on, broadcasts and whatnot, especially during Cardinal playoff games and so on and so forth, he will use that kind of "that's a winner" line in remembrance and kind of in, honor of his father, Jack Buck. Now, Jack Buck also called a lot of other games. He didn't just do baseball. He was on NFL. He did a lot of big-time NFL games. He was the original voice for the St. Louis Blues, the hockey team in the NHL. So he went further than baseball, and he really, I think, was a big trailblazer in the broadcasting world. And he's known very well, very, very well, for his radio call of the Kirk Gibson home run in 1988, where he famously called, "I don't believe what I just saw." And it really, again, I mean, it's played over the TV. It's replayed thousands of times. I mean, I get chills just reading that call being said by him. I get chills hearing it, right? I mean, it was such an incredible thing. And then you've got the crowd and everything else. And I think the beauty of both Jack Buck and Vince Scully was that they were able to know when to not talk. A really good broadcaster knows when not to talk. And they know how not to kind of let the crowd do its thing. Allow the crowd to give the people listening that aren't in the stadium and not in the stands that feeling of being at the game, being there in person. And so I think that is the true essence of being a great broadcaster, and they both did that. I will say he did come into a little bit of controversy when he made some ill-advised comments about a singer at a Pittsburgh Pirates game. He was Polish, and I believe he muffled some of the words in the Star-Spangled Banner. And Jack Buck made a comment saying something along the lines of, "If you're Polish and you're from Pittsburgh, you can get away with anything." He eventually got death threats from Pittsburgh people. A lot of people were not happy with him. And one of the main CBS guys came up to him after him and said, "Hey, you're in a little bit of trouble. You should not have said that." And so he eventually wound up kind of taking a step back a little bit. He did still do some games as time went on, though health factored in a little bit, so he kind of slowed down on the mic. He wound up towards the end of his career just doing only home games for the Cardinals. And again, on special occasions every now and again. But he eventually passed away, unfortunately. But his son, Joe Buck, as we all know, is, again, very well known. He's actually, Joe Buck and Jack Buck are the only father-son tandems to ever call Super Bowls. And they kind of bookend each other in 50 years. So Jack Buck was on the call for the Chiefs Super Bowl back in the 60s. And then Joe Buck was on the call for the Kansas City Chiefs Super Bowl back in 2019. Or 2020, however you want to look at it. So very interesting kind of how that came full circle, but definitely a very, very, I'm sure, a huge idol that Joe Buck was able to look up to, not only as a broadcaster, but his dad, too. So something that's pretty impressive, if you ask me. So getting into the next one, and this is somebody that I actually know personally. He's a family friend of mine. Really, really great guy, Tim Kirchen. Another legend. I mean, this guy, when I mean a legend, he is a legend of covering the game. Grew up in a baseball household in Maryland. His father was a big baseball guy. He always wanted to show him stats and baseball. He wound up going to Walter Johnson High School, and then he went on to University of Maryland. He wrote for the school paper there. But then out of college, this is where things get really interesting. And I started to notice that a lot of these guys, they've got very interesting journeys to where they got to eventually. So he first took a job initially with the Washington Star as a writer. The Star would then fold later that year. I think it was a couple months later. And then after he went to the Washington Star, he went to the Baltimore News American. And that also went out of business. So in about 2 months, Kirchen had lost 2 different jobs in sports. Here's another kind of side note, a little fun fact. There was an LA Times reporter that had called Tim Kirchen, and Tim had essentially thought that it was going to be something, for a job or something that was going to try and get him into work again. The guy was calling about doing a story on Tim Kirchen because he was a writer in a local, kind of market, if you will, in D.C., Washington, Baltimore, Maryland area, and how he had lost 2 writing jobs in 2 writing jobs in 2 months, and how he had been a part of 2 different newspaper outlets that folded. So it was kind of a joke that, and he was, I guess, all over the LA Times, and he was a writer, but he was not an employed writer. So that was kind of the little bit of the joke there. But then he eventually lands in Dallas, and he starts covering the Rangers for the Dallas Morning News as a beat writer. Then after that, he went on to cover the Orioles for a little bit. He eventually went on to write for Sports Illustrated. He actually covered basketball for about 6 months. Wasn't a huge fan of it, and then he wound up getting a job at ESPN as a baseball writer and TV journalist, which we see him on TV nowadays for. And his journey is just incredible, right? I think that a lot of people would have probably been deterred and kind of discouraged from wanting to continue on in that line of work after losing 2 jobs, but he stuck with it. He was always persistent. You know, the stories are always, he would go up every single day to the newspaper outlets. He would just constantly badger them, and he'd constantly be annoying about it. And so as a result, he was able to eventually work his way into where he is now, and he's somebody that I think is an icon in covering baseball, especially in today's world. He is one of the best, if not the best, baseball journalist there is, in my opinion. But there's others that have also been in the more recent years, I would say, that have also been very prominent, like Tim Kirchen, Pedro Gomez, another one that's been very prominent, especially covering for the Red Sox for so many years. He's originally from Boston. He was another person that I personally grew up idolizing. I mean, I always remember growing up watching Pedro Gomez, Tim Kirchen, Pedro Gomez. Pedro Gomez is another one. You know, Pedro Gomez and what he did and how exciting he made baseball and how lighthearted he made it. It's incredible what he could do. And the same thing with Pedro Gomez. Now, Gomez went to UNC. He worked there on the paper and the radio station, and then he wound up getting a job at the Boston Globe. He was surrounded by a lot of prominent writers for the Boston Globe, and he eventually became the main writer for the Red Sox. He then also, after a couple years with the Red Sox, he also did some work as the lead baseball columnist for Sports Illustrated. So he's there for a little bit, continuing to cover baseball. I believe he covered other sports as well. And then he got to ESPN in 1988, where he was an in-studio analyst, and he appeared on Baseball Tonight, SportsCenter, ESPN News, ESPN Radio, the whole nine. And a little fun side note about him, actually, is that Pedro Gomez is one of only 10 people on a voting panel for the Fielding Bible Awards, which is, again, an alternative to the Gold Glove Awards. So a little bit interesting there. I mean, that's kind of, a little bit of a digress in terms of awards being given out and what kind of awards there are, because, I mean, we all know what the Golden Glove is and everything else. But the fact that you've got this kind of alternative one, and he's only one of 10 people, that's a pretty exclusive club, if you ask me. And he's now with The Athletic. He's a senior writer. He still covers the game in depth today. So a really incredible individual in the sport of baseball, and especially in the covering and journalistic style or side of it as well. Some other guys I'm going to get into, there's just a couple more, honestly just 2 more. Roger Kahn. Now, Roger Kahn is somebody that he was not on TV, he was not on radio, he was not necessarily a broadcaster like a lot of these other guys are that are very in the news and very prominent media figures, but he was an incredible author, and he wrote some of the most famous books in baseball history ever. He grew up in Brooklyn, Dodgers fan, obviously. He was the reporter for the team in 1952 and 1953. He was also the sports editor for the Newsweek in 1956. But what he was known for, again, was the books that he wrote. I mean, he authored the incredibly well-known book, The Boys of Summer. I've never personally read it, but I've heard that it's a great book. It was about the relationship he had with his dad, kind of through the lens of their shared affection for the Brooklyn Dodgers. So a beautiful thing to use kind of a father-son's share of a love of the same team as a catalyst to show the relationship that the two formed over time. It's pretty impressive being able to kind of almost personify a son and father relationship into or kind of project it through the eyes of being sports fans. That's a really, really impressive thing to do. He also authored the book Good Enough to Dream, which is about his years as a minor league owner, and he also authored several other books. But he was one of the best to ever use the pen as a bat to pencil the biggest home runs in novels, and he really, really did that. I mean, Roger Kahn is a name that kind of ranked, and I think a lot of people would say, oh, yeah, and I'm sure he was probably a big influence for guys like Pedro Gomez and Pedro Gomez and Tim Kirchen, and it's kind of interesting to see, who those guys were influenced by, and then nowadays kind of the next up-and-coming class of broadcasters and journalists who they're inspired by as well. So the last one I want to touch on and really kind of highlight, because I've always been a big fan of his, especially when it comes to Fox Baseball, Ken Rosenthal. very well-known journalist, probably more so well-known for the outfits he wears and the bow ties he has and whatnot. But he was a little, again, a little bit more recent. Started out in 1984 with the York Daily Record, but then moved to the Courier-Post in Cherry Hill, New Jersey for 2 years. He was a UPenn graduate. He wound up getting a full-time job at the Baltimore Sun, but at the same time, he was also simultaneously contributing to Sports Illustrated from 1990 to 2000. As time went on, he eventually joined Fox and the MLB Network, and he's now a writer for The Athletic. So he does a lot of different things, and we've all probably have seen him when it comes to the World Series and when it comes to playoff baseball. He's usually the on-field reporter, somebody that is probably more so, I would say, known for kind of the latest insight, the breaking news, the biggest development kind of individual, if you will. Great writer. And he's somebody that I think he gives it how it is. And not to mention, he kind of has a style about him, right, with the bow ties and how he matches outfits and whatnot. So as a result, it's something that kind of resonates with people, and they say, oh, he's the bow tie guy. And that's how you remember Ken Rosenthal. So it's a very intelligent thing to do. But ultimately, there's so many people that I probably could have picked out. Again, Pedro Gomez, another one that I was always a huge fan of, and it's so unfortunate that he's no longer with us. But there's so many of them that were just so iconic in the game of baseball. And really, I think the difference in how the game was projected out to the public was shared with the people. They were able to get that information out, how they did it so eloquently, so beautifully. And I think it made people become interested, especially back a long time ago when people weren't necessarily going to games all the time, right? I mean, it probably was very expensive back. I mean, it's still expensive in some markets to go to games, but back then it was probably pretty expensive across the board to go to games. Not to mention, there's not as many teams back then. So having those guys there to be the voices and the eyes and ears for the people at home really, I think, broadened baseball's horizon and its reach throughout the entire country as to the fans and the fandom and the following that the sport has. It's pretty incredible to see what journalists and broadcasters can do for the sport without even having to play. But folks, that's going to close things out for us in our second segment here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Thanks again for tuning in. Coming up after the commercial, I'm going to give out grades for the NL East team's offseason moves and discuss which teams I think made the biggest acquisitions in the offseason. It's been a lot of fun so far, but we have a lot more to go, so don't change that channel. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be, visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Great to have you all here still with me today. Jack Ridenhour again. And in the previous segment, I got into discussing some of the greatest baseball journalists of all time and what their careers were like and where they are now and also what they've meant to the game. But I want to now get into a little divisional grading of some teams' off-season moves and share my thoughts on which teams made some of the best moves but stick strictly in the NL East. So I want to discuss the NL East because I think they're one of the most intriguing divisions in terms of the talent that they went out and got amongst all teams. Again, every single team I think added at least one solid piece. I would say maybe outside of the Miami Marlins, everybody else added at least one major piece to their team that is going to do, I think, wonders this year and probably even moving forward. So getting into it, I want to first discuss the New York Mets. As we all know, they go out, they add Francisco Lindor, go and trade for him. You add James McCann, and you get Carlos Carrasco. those are the major ads, but some of the sneaky good moves that they got were Tawan Walker and Marcus Strowman. Now, I know Marcus Strowman was already with the team, but them going out and extending a qualifying offer, he accepted it. That was big, because if you look at this rotation and who they had on their rotation at the time, and I remember talking about it way back when there was kind of this discussion of, who are they going to go out and get? Are they going to go and get Bauer? Are they going to go doing this? Are they going to go and do that? Because DeGrom and then Syndergaard, but Syndergaard has been injured, so a lot of people are kind of like, well, we don't know when he's coming back. Then you had Michael Wacha, who did not play well last year, and he was going to be a free agent, and he did leave. And then you had Marcus Strowman. So if you had lost Marcus Strowman, you would have to have at least figured you'd have only one reliable starter in that situation, because you don't know what Syndergaard's health is going to be like coming back to full strength. So them getting Marcus Strowman to come back, accept that qualifying offer, I think is big. Then they go out and get Tawan Walker. I really like this because Walker is a guy that isn't necessarily going to be your ace. I think that on a lot of teams he would be an ace, but on a team like this, probably not an ace. But what he is a great back-end rotation starter. And I had mentioned this in a couple segments ago on this same episode, that if you want to go out and get a guy that is going to be a reliable arm for you as a fourth starter or a fifth starter, I think that you can say Tawan Walker is right up there for one of the best options in that situation. And if you look at their whole rotation, if you've got Strowman and Walker towards the back end of it, that's some of the best back-end starting pitching that you can possibly get in baseball. And then not to mention you have Francisco Lindor, you add James McCann, and honestly, I think the McCann move was one of their wiser moves because of all the talk that they were going to go out and get Real Muto, this, that, and the other. They saved hundreds of millions of dollars by not signing Real Muto and going out and getting McCann, who is very productive. He's coming off an all-star year in 2019, somebody who batted his career high in 2020 at 289. So clearly a guy that can do it both behind the plate and at the plate. Because if you also think about it, they go on and get Francisco Lindor. They might try and prioritize Lindor going into this upcoming offseason in 2021 because he is a free agent. So you would not want to tie up a whole bunch of money with Real Muto, and then if you wanted to also go and get, you couldn't have gotten both, in my opinion. I don't think that they would have been able to get both. I think they would have had to go one way or another, and I think the way that they went was the best route, going and getting Lindor, getting a solid, reliable catcher in McCann, and then you also add Carlos Carrasco. If you look at this rotation, again, Carrasco, Walker, Strowman, Syndergaard, DeGrom, that's going to be the most feared starting five rotation next to Snell, Darvish, Lamet, Musgrove, and when Clevenger comes back, Clevenger. That's going to be the two best starting rotations in the NL, hands down, without a question. So overall, I'm going to give them an A- in my free agency grading. I really like what they did. I really thought that they addressed the issues that they needed to address, and they also filled those voids with really, really solid pieces also. So the next team, the Washington Nationals. And this is a team that they didn't necessarily make any small, minor moves. I think that they made a lot of really big moves. They made some big splash moves. They're coming off a year where they were one of the worst, if not the worst, baseball teams in all of the MLB. And then the year before that, you were the World Series champion. So a big up and down. I mean, talk about a very, very sharp peak and then a very, very sharp drop from one year to the next. But if you also look at their lineup and who they had on their lineup, outside of Soto and Turner, the rest of the lineup batted a combined 245, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe it was 250. But they were nowhere near the numbers that Soto and Turner put up. So if Soto and Turner were the real reasons why they were that good, there's no reason for why they were, there is a reason why they were so bad, because they had nobody else to go to. They had no other help. And Soto had to do everything. Turner had to do everything. Soto had batted .351. He led the NL and the entire MLB in OPS and slugging percentage. The guy's 21 years old. And then Turner had a career season as well. But then everyone else just kind of dropped off. So that's why I think the Nationals went out and got the pieces that they got. The major ads that I think that they went after were Josh Bell and Brad Hand. Josh Bell, because Josh Bell is, in my opinion, he is an all-star caliber player. He's somebody that could be a consistent all-star if he's on the right team. And I think that being in Pittsburgh, being in that market, I don't really know if that was really great for his career. Now he's in Washington. Now he's in a totally different ballpark. He's in a totally different division, but he is also in a very tough division, especially pitching-wise. So I do think that he can get back to that all-star level. I think he can put up some really big numbers. And then Brad Hand, because let's face it, Nationals fans, Daniel Hudson was not going to be your main closer to come out of the pen. He had a 6.1 ERA. Sure, he had a decent record, but I mean, outside of that, you can't have a closer that's got more than a 3 ERA, in my opinion. Brad Hand, 3-time All-Star, coming off a year where he was first in the MLB in saves at 16. So if you ask me, I think those are the two big moves. But then the sneaky good moves that they made, Kyle Schwarber, because I don't know if Schwarber is necessarily the talented player that Josh Bell is per se, but I definitely would give Schwarber this. If you needed 25 homers and 90 RBIs out of the guy, and he'd maybe bat 265, he's going to do that for you, and he's going to do that very, very well. He's not a great fielder, and neither is Josh Bell, so that does kind of pose a little bit of an issue in my opinion, but at the same time, I think that they're more so trying to address the lack of offense that they had, because again, if you've got an entire lineup batting 250 outside of two guys that are really just pretty much the only reason why you guys are anywhere near being decent. I mean, last year they were terrible, so that last year doesn't even count because it would not have mattered what Soto and Turner were going to do because they could not carry that team anywhere because they didn't have any help. And now they've got help. Now they've got a guy that batted 37 home runs in 2019. Schwarber had 38 home runs or whatever it was in 2019 as well. So two guys that put up some serious home run numbers. I think that was very wise on their part. And then another really sneaky move that I don't think people realize how good this move's going to be, but it's Jeremy Jeffries. They went out, they got him, former relief pitcher for the Milwaukee Brewers. They did sign him to a minor league deal. But last year, I mean, he had a really, really good season. He had about a 1.4, 1.5 ERA. He was 4-1 in relief appearances. So somebody coming out of the pen and somebody as probably a setup guy for Brad Hand, that's not too bad of a setup guy if you ask me. I mean, he was a really good setup guy for Josh Hader when he was in Milwaukee, and I think he's going to do just the same thing in Washington. So I'm going to give the Nationals an A-, mainly because of what they started with this offseason and what they're ending up with. I think that they've got a completely different lineup, completely revamped, and that's the thing between them and the Mets. The Mets have a bunch of really young talent. They have all the young talent in the world already there. The Nationals, not so much. You've got Soto and you've got Turner. Outside of that, there isn't a ton of young talent. So you need to go out and get some established veteran talent. So Josh Bell, Kyle Schwarber. And then you definitely need some arms in the bullpen. Brad Hand, Jeremy Jeffries. So I think that they deserve an A-. I really like what they did because I think they really revamped and kind of revitalized this lineup a little bit. So getting into the Marlins now, honestly not really impressed with what the Marlins did, right? I think we can all agree that I think that they're in a different stage of development in terms of they're a very young team that I think in a couple years with a little bit of work, maybe a piece here added, a piece here added every so often, maybe a big trade here and there, like what they did this past year at the trade deadline, going out and getting Starling Marte. I think that that's what they can do over time. This year, the only real major adds they had was John Curtis from the Rays, and I really like Curtis. He was very good for the Rays, especially in the playoffs. Great arm coming out of the bullpen, and so I think that having him is going to do, a little bit, but it's not going to do much. They didn't really have any sneaky good moves. I didn't think that they were very active. They re-signed a lot of guys. They signed a lot of guys to some minor league deals. So again, they're building for the future. I think that they are kind of in this 5-year plan mindset where we're going to look down the road, we're going to look 5 years down the road, and we're going to reassess along the way. So I'm going to move out of the Marlins because, again, they didn't really do a whole lot. I'm going to give them a C+. I'm giving them a C+ because it wasn't like they were completely non-existent, but they didn't really do anything that spectacular. John Curtis was really it. So I'm giving them a C+. Now, getting into the Phillies, and then I'll finish up with the Braves. The Phillies, they did what they needed to do. They needed to re-sign JT Realmuto. They needed to sign Didi Gregorius. Those were probably the two biggest free agents that were up for re-signing that I think that any team could have re-signed. There were, probably other players in all honesty, but in terms of what the Phillies needed and what Realmuto and Gregorius bring to the table, there was no question that the Phillies were in dire need of re-signing those two. And Dave Dombrowski, he did a great job. I mean, he's a guy that has built winning teams at pretty much everywhere he's gone. Boston, Florida when he was with the Marlins, Detroit. Even though Detroit didn't win a World Series, they went to one. He wins a World Series with the Marlins. He wins a World Series with the Red Sox. So Dave Dombrowski knows how to build winning teams. He understands that, and he gets that. Getting Real Muto, getting Gregorius, and then you also have to remember they re-signed Hoskins and they re-signed Eflin. So re-signing those four guys, I think, is going to set them up very nicely because Eflin, I think, is a very good up-and-coming pitcher. And Rhys Hoskins, I think he's got the potential to be a really, really solid bat in this lineup next to Alec Baum. I think that they could complement each other very well. Not to mention you already have Bryce Harper tied up for a bunch of years. So, you kind of had to go out and make some, various re-signings if you wanted to find yourself in any sort of contending conversation. Now, a couple sneaky good moves they made, and they needed to do it. There was no question they needed to do it. Archie Bradley and Jose Alvarado. The reason why I put those two there is because this bullpen was literally the worst bullpen in the last 90 years in baseball. They had that bad of a bullpen ERA. And if you look at their bullpen pitching, it was pretty bad. They had a lot of guys that were floating around 6-7 ERAs, and the same thing with their starting pitching. Outside of Eflin, outside of Wheeler, they didn't really have a whole lot. They didn't have a ton of help. And so that is another issue that they are going to probably run into if they don't continue to address it. But they've done a pretty good job with addressing the starting pitching. They go out, they got Chase Anderson as well. I think that they need a little bit more starting pitching, but them going and getting those bullpen pieces. And I know Bradley's coming off a year when he was in Arizona. He didn't pitch great. He had a 4.2 ERA, but he is somebody that is capable of being a solid arm. And then Jose Alvarado, he's very established, I think. I think he's one of the more kind of under-the-radar pitchers as a relief guy. And you bring in somebody like that, I definitely think it could shake some things up in the division. So ultimately, I'm going to give them a B+ because I think that they addressed a lot of needs that they needed to address. They probably had some of the most issues to address out of all the teams in this division this offseason, without question, especially with the bullpen, because no other team in this division, I think, had as big of a problem with their overall team as the Phillies did with their bullpen. Maybe the Nationals with their hitting and their starting lineup, but I think that we can agree the Phillies having the worst bullpen ERA in the last 90 years, that's definitely something that you need to figure out and you need to fix. And they did that. I will give them that. We'll see how it pans out this year, but ultimately, I have pretty good hopes for the Phillies, so I'm going to give them a B+. And then my last team, obviously, the Atlanta Braves. A couple major adds, Charlie Morton and Marcell Ozuna. Marcell Ozuna, I would say, next to Real Muto and Gregorius, would be the next biggest must-have re-sign out of any team that had a free agent that was up for free agency this year. Marcell Ozuna had to be re-signed no matter what, because if the Braves want to find themselves as a contending team, which now I think that they are, they needed somebody to kind of surround Freddie Freeman with. Sure, you've got Albies. Sure, you've got Acuna. Sure, you've got Swanson. You've got various pieces, but Ozuna really ties a nice little bow on this present, and I think is going to, again, do a lot of damage. I don't know if he'll put up the numbers he put up last year, per se, but I definitely think that he can still be really productive. Now, I do kind of wonder if he's going back into the field and he wants to be an everyday starter, what is that going to do to his health? Because he's had shoulder problems, right? And let's say, for example, he tweaks his shoulder throwing a ball to the cutoff guy. Who knows? All of a sudden, that just throws everything out of whack. You've got 4 years and $64 million tied up with the guy. You really have to hope that he's not going to get injured. Charlie Morton, though, on the other hand, is a great ad, and I think that out of all the MLB teams, the Braves made one of the best kind of substitutes, or at least filling of voids, if you will, on their team out of all teams that had to do that, because they absolutely needed a third experienced starting pitcher. Because if you watched the Braves last year in the NLCS, it really dipped down. Once they got through Max Fried and once they got through Ian Anderson, there was no other help. And I think that was what the issue was. They could have probably beaten the Dodgers. In all honesty, if Charlie Morton was on the Braves in 2020, I genuinely believe that the Braves and the Rays would have met up in the World Series, and we would be having a very different conversation about who the World Series champion was. I don't know who would win between those two, but I can definitely tell you this. With a 3-1 lead in the NLCS, and Charlie Morton's on the mound, I would bet every single dollar that I own that he would win that game. Every single dollar, no question. whether it's a do or die game or as a series clinching game to go to the World Series, I'm putting my money on Charlie Morton. He is one of the most clutch playoff pitchers we have seen in the last 5 years, I would say. Now, a sneaky good move for the Braves, Jake Lamb. And I mentioned this in the first segment. I wouldn't say that he's going to be a superstar, but I'm not going to say that he's going to be bad. I'm going to say that he's going to be a solid overall player. I think that he's going to be a solid piece for them. If you need somebody to be a reliable hitter towards the bottom of the lineup, Jake Lamb is exactly that. You could stick him in the 6th, maybe 7th hole, and all of a sudden you've got a guy that he's got pop potential. With a season, a couple of years ago, he had 30 home runs, over 100 RBIs. So he's clearly got the potential to hit that hard, to hit that far, and to be that productive from the plate. And I think that this team, it's an offensive-driven team. We can totally tell that from now, right now. And I remember going into the playoffs last year, there was a lot of questions about their starting pitching and just their pitching overall. They got into the playoffs, and all of a sudden they had the best team ERA by a mile. And so everyone was like, wow, where did this come from? Ian Anderson was lights out, and I think that they've got a really kind of a gem hidden in a hard place to find in Ian Anderson. And I think in Max Fried, no question, he's going to be a really good pitcher. I mean, the guy was 8-0 or 7-0 or whatever he was last year. If I'm not mistaken, the Braves, I think they were 14-0 out of the 14 starts he had. And now he obviously didn't win all 14 of those games. But if I'm not mistaken, they won every single game he started, or at least only lost one of them. So the impact those two have is very deep. Going and getting Morton, very smart. And now you re-sign Ozuna, you go out and get Jake Lamb. I think you can put yourselves into a pretty good conversation. I don't know, though, if it's necessarily going to take you to the World Series. I don't know if it's going to necessarily take you to the NLCS. It could, because there is a very high potential and a high reward factor in this. But again, Lamb and Ozuna are both injury-ridden over the last few years, especially Lamb, who's been battling rotator cuff issues. Ozuna's got shoulder problems. So there is kind of a concern there. That's why I'm going to give them a B-, just because they are, in terms of injuries, somewhat of a concern. Because if you go out and you get a guy like Ozuna, you get him up for 4 years, $64 million, and he's injured for 75% of those 4 years, you've wasted about $60-some-odd million right there. And again, that's a little bit of a ballpark. Jake Lamb, not as much risk in that one, but I will say you still could have gotten a lot of other, I would say, third baseman free agents that are out on the market and are still not tied up with a team. So I think there could have been probably a better option, but again, there is a very, very high reward factor in this. So high risk, high reward, I'm going to go B-. So overall, I'm going to give this whole division a solid B+. I really like the moves that they made. I would say the one thing that's keeping me away from putting them in the A category is the Marlins. I really think that if they had made one or two big splashes, I think then I would definitely put them as an A- division in terms of their free agency moves. But again, Braves, I'm giving them a B-, Phillies a B+, Marlins a C+, Nationals A-, and the Mets A-. So we'll see how this division plays out, because I think it could be a toss-up between 4 different teams, in all honesty. So that'll do it for this segment, folks. Thanks again for sticking around, but stay right there, because we'll be right back after this commercial break for the final segment today, where I'll be back in another Buy It or Deny It segment discussing whether I buy or deny the idea that the NL will have more 95-win teams this season than the AL. Folks, don't go anywhere, because we've got one last segment here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast.
Want to know the latest in soccer? Then listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Soccer Podcast. From MLS, the World Cup, and the Premier League, we've got you covered. The latest updates, the hottest matches, and news on the league's top players. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Soccer Podcast.
David Beckham scores the goal to take England all the way to the World Cup final.
Listen now.
Hey everyone, and welcome back for the final segment here today on the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Jack Ridenauer still with you, and in the previous segment I jumped into grading some of the offseason moves by the NL East teams and sharing my thoughts on the various moves that happened over the offseason in the East. But I want to close things out with a buy it or deny it segment and discuss whether I buy or deny the idea that the NL will have more 95-win teams in the league than the AL will. So, as we all know, and I continue to sound like a broken record, and I know that, but let's face it, folks, there was a lot of things done and shaken up over in the NL as opposed to the AL, I personally think. Now, looking at kind of last year's statistics, well, not necessarily last year's kind of an outlier, so 2019. The NL in 2019 had two 95-win teams. They had the Braves and the Dodgers. And as we all know, the Dodgers went on to they actually got bounced out of the playoffs early, and then over in the AL in 2019, they had five 95-win teams. The Yankees, the Rays, the Astros, who went on to the World Series, and the Athletics and the Twins. Now, let's face it with the Twins. The Twins are a very good regular season team. And I think that they are kind of a misnomer in this because although that they will maybe win 98 games or 100 games, they're not going to go very far in the playoffs. And I hate to say that for anybody out there that's a Minnesota fan, but let's face it, your team is on, I think, the longest major professional North American sport playoff drought or playoff losing streak of like 18 years or whatever it might be, something astronomical. So the Twins, when I say a 95-win team, I do mean a team that's going to win 95 games, but the Twins, I feel like, are such a odd 95-win team because you never know what you're going to get with them. The Athletics have been pretty consistent the last few years, and the Astros, I think, are going to start falling off. The Rays, I don't know what to think of them, and the Yankees, I think they could be a team that definitely gets up to 95 wins. But over in the NL, I got to say, there's a lot of teams that I could see winning 95 games this year with the personnel that they went out and got, with the personnel they have returning, and just sheerly all of the competition there is as well. Now, looking at 2018, the AL also had more 95-win teams, but with the Astros losing some pieces, I really don't see them being that dominant of a 100-plus win team. I don't see that anymore. If you look at last year and how they played last year, they make it to the playoffs with a losing record. And in all honesty, if either the Rangers or the Mariners or the Angels had a little bit of a better season, the Astros probably would not have made the playoffs, in all honesty. They were, I believe, 29-31 when they made it. And so as a result, I'm kind of like, I don't really know what to think of the Astros. You know, you lose George Springer, who's one of the best postseason players over the last couple years. Great leadoff hitter with a lot of power. But who are you going to go out and get right now, right? I mean, they only re-signed Michael Brantley. I don't think that Zach Greinke's got a whole lot left in him. I question whether Justin Verlander will be 100% healthy this year, and also if he's got anything really left in the tank as well. So I do think that they could be maybe an 85-win team, maybe a 90-win team, but I don't see them being a 95-win team. Now, the NL has added a boatload of talent. I mean, a lot of talent. And honestly, they've gotten a lot of talent from AL teams. Look at Francisco Lindor and Carlos Carrasco, both from the Indians, now with the Mets. You've got Charlie Morton with the Rays and now with the Braves. You've got Blake Snell, now was with the Rays, and he's now with the Padres. So you've got a lot of guys that have gone from AL teams over to NL teams. And sure, you had a lot of AL teams that had some big ads, obviously. I mean, you look at George Springer going to the Blue Jays. He stayed in the AL for the most part. But then Michael Brantley re-signing with the Astros, DJ LeMahieu re-signing with the Yankees. But again, you had a lot of guys that re-signed with their NL teams. Look at the Phillies and who they had re-signed, right? So I think that, again, there's a lot of talent in this division, or in this league. There's a lot of talent between, the NL East, the NL West for the most part, and even in the NL Central, right? I mean, you've got Nolan Arenado there now. Colton Wong is there now. I've heard rumors right now that Jackie Bradley Jr. might be on the move to the Brewers, so that would be another AL guy coming over to the NL. A lot of guys are coming over to the NL. And so I definitely feel that the NL has kind of gotten a little bit of a one-up on the AL. The Red Sox are another team that I would say are nowhere near where they were in 2018, right? Let's face it. 2018, they had 108 wins. They go on to the World Series. Very, very, very different team from last year. And obviously, they lost a lot of guys. I mean, again, look at another guy that went over from the AL over to the NL. Mookie Betts, perfect example. Guy goes from the Red Sox over the Dodgers. So you start to see a little bit of a trend as time goes on. And so I think that we are going to start to see an increase in that trend as time goes on as well. And right now, I think a lot of these teams that in the AL were really good a few years ago, they're not going to be the same. I think they're going to go through a little bit of a rebuild phase. I'm not saying the Red Sox are going to be bad. I'm not saying the Astros are going to be bad. I just don't think that they're going to be teams that are going to dominate. I don't see them being dominating this year. I could see them being good, solid AL teams, but not great AL teams. Now, look at a team like over in the NL that has completely rebounded from where they were a couple years ago. 2 years ago, the Padres were dead last in the West. Dead last in the West. 2019, the same thing. They spent 2 straight years in the bottom of the NL West. Now, they've seen a ginormous turnaround. The Mets are much better than they were in 2019 when they had 86 wins. I think that they are way better than an 86-win team. So things have definitely shifted, and you're starting to see that trend a little bit. So I don't know why people are still kind of caught up on the AL. If people are caught up on the AL, I think the NL is slowly starting to become that main league that is going to be the dominating league. I mean, let's face it, they've got the best division in the league in terms of talent-wise with the NL East. That is the best division in baseball, in my opinion. Now, with that being said, there are some teams in the AL that have come a long way as well. I mean, look at the White Sox, right? They were third-place team in 2019. Now they're a team that's second. They are probably capable of being first, in all honesty. I could actually see them being a first-place team this year. And Tampa and Oakland are 2 key teams to keep watch for in the AL because they're definitely 95-win teams. They're capable of doing that. But I just don't know if their uncharacteristic ways of winning with a lack of superstar power and a lack of, really, really good players is going to continue to be sustainable, or if it's going to continue to be, what works for them, in all honesty. Because, again, you can only do something for so much until people figure it out. And I feel like Tampa and Oakland, they can get figured out as time goes on. So I think that the talent is still there in Tampa and Oakland, but it's nowhere near what it is in teams like over in the NL. And so I think that we're going to start seeing kind of a little bit of a shift in that. And especially, look at what Tampa lost. Tampa lost 2/3 of their top pitching. Oakland lost an MVP finalist from 2019 in Marcus Semien. So, and Chris, not to mention, they traded away Chris Davis. So there are guys that are no longer with these teams that 2 or 3 years ago were with them, and they were probably really big key pieces to why they were so successful. Now we're going to probably start seeing other teams in the AL, I will say, like Toronto, start to skyrocket because they've quickly ascended through the ranks in the baseball world in terms of talent and just ability. Not to mention, I mean, they're going to build off of a great 2020 season. They go out and get George Springer. And I had a feeling they were going to do something special this offseason. I mean, when you offer DJ LeMahieu a 4-year, $76 million deal, I think you're really not playing around. You're being real serious about that. So I think we will see teams like Toronto skyrocket. But again, look at that division. I don't know what to think of the Rays. I don't know what to think of the Red Sox. And those are 2 teams that a couple years ago were 95-plus win teams. And the Yankees, yes, the Yankees will be the Yankees. I will give them that. Although I think that their rotation coming into the season might be a little bit shaky. We don't really know what to think of it quite yet because, honestly, we haven't seen Tyone pitch in the last year. We haven't seen Corey Kluber pitch in the last 2 years, right? And the AL Central. Look at who has left the AL Central. You don't have Carrasco and you don't have Lindor with the Indians anymore. They didn't really go out and add anybody, I would say, major. I mean, maybe Eddie Rosario, but that's about it. The Twins re-signed Nelson Cruz. I'll give them that. And they got Andrelton Simmons. But the Tigers haven't really done anything that special. The Royals, I mean, they did a lot of minor moves, a lot of little moves, but they didn't do anything that's going to, I think, take them to the whole next level. And I know I've gone on here and have been very, very optimistic of what Kansas City is doing, but at the same time, I just don't think that it's going to get them to where they want to be this year. I think it's, again, a long-term project. Now I think you're going to start seeing maybe 1 or 2 good teams in, say, the East with the Yankees and the Blue Jays. And then the Central, you have the Twins and the White Sox. I don't think the Indians will be good, and I definitely don't think the Tigers or the Royals will be good. But then over in the, and I mean, let's face it, the AL West, you've got the A's and maybe the Astros. The Astros are a big question mark, in my opinion. But now over in the NL, you've got one division that could have 4 really good teams in it, with the NL East having the Nats, the Mets, the Braves, and the Phillies. And then look at over in the NL West. Now you've got the Padres, and you've got the Dodgers. And who knows, the NL Central could be a big surprise division this year. We have no idea. If Jackie Bradley Jr. goes to the Milwaukee Brewers, I'm going to say this right now, they will win the division. The Brewers will win the division because they go out and get Colton Wong. They could go out and get Bradley Jr. I think they re-signed Travis Shaw, which I'm not quite sure why they did that. But at the end of the day, I think that could be a very, very sneaky division that could get a team that winds up having 95-plus wins this season. it is a little bit of a stretch. I will admit that, because the talent is not nearly at the level that it is in the NL West or the NL East. But the Central could still have somebody that surprises you. Now, again, let's compare the NL Central, speaking of the NL Central, and the AL West, because they are pretty comparable. They're the two, I would say, weaker divisions in their respective leagues. And then you kind of look at the NL East and the AL East. The NL East clearly has more teams that I think are going to be better this year than the AL East. The NL Central and the AL West, I think the NL Central just barely ekes past them, because I think that the Cardinals and the Brewers could have better years than the A's and the Astros, because I think the Astros are the weak link in that. But then you look at the NL West and the AL Central and try and compare those two divisions, and you clearly see that the NL West, they've got the Padres and the Dodgers that will highlight that division. You know the White Sox will be good. We have no idea what to think of the Twins. The Twins are another team. Again, the Twins are kind of a hit-or-miss team. You never know what direction they're going to go in. And so I think that with how much talent the NL East has, and then the rest of the teams that could fall through, I definitely could see, a couple teams having some big seasons. So ultimately, I'm going to have to buy this claim 100%. I think that the reign of the AL is over, and that the NL is going to start to dominate again. And I think that they will have more 95-win teams this year than the AL. I really do believe that. I think that the Nats could get to over 95 wins. I think the Mets could. I think the Phillies could. I think the Braves could. All four of those teams are capable of it. I don't think all four are going to necessarily actually do it, but they are capable of it. The Padres and the Dodgers, no question. So then right there, you've got 6 teams I just rattled off. Let's say only 2 of them actually get 95-plus wins. You could filter in another 1 or 2 of those. I don't see, again, over in the AL, a team like the Twins having 95-plus wins. I could see the White Sox. I could see the White Sox winning 98 games. Maybe the Twins win 89. The Indians win maybe around 80-something. And then the Royals and the Tigers, filter in after. And I think that over in the AL East, we'll have to see how the Red Sox are. The Red Sox are a big question mark for me. I don't really know what to think of them right now. I want to be optimistic about them, but I just don't know what Chris Sale's, level of health is at right now. I mean, he's been out of baseball for a whole year, so what does that do to somebody? Eduardo Rodriguez, he had his bouts with COVID over the summer, so who knows how healthy he will be and if he's going to be, back up to speed, or if he even decides to play. And then look at kind of David Price. I mean, he is kind of one guy, I will say, that went from the NL to the AL in that big trade, but he didn't even play last year. So who knows if he'll play with COVID still being an issue right now. So I think ultimately, you've got, at least in the AL East, you can probably bank on 2 teams. The AL Central, maybe 2 teams. But the AL West, I don't think that there could be 2 teams that win 95-plus wins. I really don't think that. And then the NL East, you have 4 teams that could definitely do it. Maybe 1 team in the Central, but then 2 teams in the West. So, yes, I'm going to 100% buy this claim. I definitely think that the NL will have more 95-win teams this year than the AL. So that's how I'm going to roll with that. And, again, we'll just have to see how it goes, because there's a lot of things that could get factored in with COVID, people opting out, injuries, so on and so forth. And so there could be a lot of changes along the way. But, folks, I think that's going to wrap it up for us here today. And as always, thank you so much for listening to the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review that really helps us. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, we would really appreciate that. And until next time, everybody, thanks so much for listening and have a wonderful day.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.